Hello there, my friends. I hope you're doing good on this Wednesday. It's time for another midweek check-in and challenge. If you've ever read the book, The Pilgrim's Progress, it is an interesting book. It's an allegory. And the main character in the book is a guy by the name of Christian, and he's trying to travel to the celestial city. Well, while he's on his way, he comes to the slough and falls into the mire. It's called the Slough of Despond. And he has a rough time there trying to get out, and finally he gets some help from a guy named Help. And as he's getting out, he says, why doesn't somebody mend this patch of land so other weary travelers don't fall into the Slough of Despond? And the guy who helps him says the miry slough is such a place that can't be mended. And how true that is in our own lives, no matter how hard we try, no matter how spiritually mature we are, miry sloughs are inevitable. We're going to have times in our lives that are just hard because no one is immune to despondency. So again, he says despondency is such a place that can't be mended. It can only be traveled through. And so today, I want us to talk about this idea of when life gets dark, when things get hard. We're going to talk about the subject of depression, because we all deal with some form of sadness in our lives, and we're going to talk about a little bit more between the difference between sadness and depression. But for everybody, sometimes life isn't so great. Sometimes things don't go well. Sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes things are just painful. And so this Wednesday, we're going to be covering the topic of depression. So let's talk about what depression is, because if you ask different people, you might get different definitions. But largely, depression it's a continuum. You might be on the lighter side or on the heavier side, but it's feelings of sadness, emptiness, not being able to have fun, enjoy activities that you used to enjoy. It's constantly being tired, worn down, perhaps feelings of worthlessness, hopeless. Sometimes people with depression experience anger. And I think if we're honest, we can all say at some point we felt depressed. Maybe not clinically depressed, but at some point we've all felt depressed. In the United States, really around the world, depression is quite a problem. In the U.S. alone, it affects 17.3 million adults at any given time in any given year. That's about 7.1% of the U.S. population of people 18 years and older. So 7% of the population in any given year, 18 years and older. Depression is actually the leading cause of disability worldwide. It's one of those things that keeps people from being able to live, normal, productive lives. Adolescents ages 12 to 17 years old had the highest rate of major depressive episodes. And an episode is just a period of depression, not necessarily something that can be a long time, but it's an episode of depression. And 14.4% was for 12 to 17-year-olds. And for 18 to 25-year-olds, it's 13.8% of those have experienced a major depressive episode. Now, severe depression among college students rose from 9.4% in 2013 to 21.1% in 2018. That is a considerable leap. The rate of moderate to severe depression rose from 23.2% to 41.1% for adolescents between the years of 2007 to 2018. So depression has been on the rise for quite some time in our countries, and it's one of the biggest concerns, biggest health concerns in our country as well. Now, oftentimes depression is often misunderstood by well-meaning people, but since we're Christians, I'm going to specifically talk to us by well-meaning Christians. A lot of times I hear people say to a depressed person, well, just be happy. Let's think about that. If they could do that, don't you think they would? It kind of aggravates me when I hear it, because if somebody could just change and flip the switch and be happy, certainly they would do that. But what's interesting when it comes to depression is that most people don't seek help when they feel depressed. Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think most people try to deal with their depression themselves? One thing I think we often think is that we're the only people to feel this way or to experience the problems that we experience. We have the tendency to think that we're alone in our problems, that something is wrong with us, so we better keep it to ourselves, or that other people might not care, or that they might think we're damaged goods. And another problem is people tend to not talk about depression that much, especially at church. You don't often hear this topic spoken on. So let me ask you this. Does the Bible talk about depression? Do we see depression in the Bible? Well, actually, yeah. The Bible is full of people that struggle with depression. The Psalms are full of depression. Let me read a couple of these to you. You can hear the language here. Psalm 13, 1 through 2. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Now, David wrote that, and I think David battled, or at least had some major depressive episodes throughout his life. Another psalm, Psalm 69, 1 through 4, he says, Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths, that slough of despond, where there is no foothold. He says, I have come into the deep waters, the floods have engulfed me. I'm worn out, calling for help. My throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for you, God. Those who hate me without reason outnumber the hairs of my head. My enemies are without cause, those who seek to destroy me. I mean, there it is. You can see in that language, you can feel the helplessness of David's words. You can feel the abandonment, the sadness, the hurt, the worry. And what does the Bible tell us about David? Well, David was a man after God's own heart. Nobody's immune to emotional problems or even psychological problems. King David certainly wasn't immune to depression, and none of us are. Let me read you one more verse from Solomon. And again, this was, David's son. Solomon was the most interesting man in the world, you could say, and was quite wealthy, had it all. In Ecclesiastes 1 through 2, he says, meaningless. Everything is meaningless, utterly meaningless. Many people in the Bible dealt with, at the very least, depressive episodes. Job, David, Jeremiah, Elijah. We could go on and on. Now, we should note that there are different kinds of depression. Sometimes what people call depression is just sadness, and it's totally normal to feel sadness sometimes. If you've ever seen the Disney Pixar film Up, it's a really cool film for kids and adults as well on experiencing emotion. And, sadness plays its role in our lives. It's a God-given emotion. And, sometimes sadness really makes those periods of happiness all the more sweet. But we need to feel these different emotions. It's okay to feel loss and sadness. Sometimes we feel down or low or helpless or sad. And it just doesn't last, incredibly long. And then sometimes, moving toward a more clinical idea of depression, it's there for a long time and it impacts people's life, and life isn't normal anymore, and they just feel like they can't move past it, and they struggle sometimes for weeks or months, and for some people even years, and sometimes they can't even put it into words as to why. There's also a disorder, if you look at bipolar disorder, it's low periods of depression where you're low, and then periods of mania where you're high. And sometimes people just cycle back and forth between those things. And it's also a very debilitating and problematic, aspect of mental health. So if you were going to guess, what would you say that the cause of depression is? And I think this is, anytime you talk about something like this, there are certainly many facets to a topic like this. And so let's start off with this. Part of depression for many people, not all, is genetic. If your parents or you have an aunt or grandparents or a relative that deals with depression, then we may be more likely to deal with depression. Now, it doesn't automatically mean that that's the case. It just means that it's more likely, just the same way that, if your parents have brown eyes, you might be likely to have brown eyes just due to the genetics of it. And there's also a biological component to this as well. Some people just have, a brain chemistry that doesn't want to stay lined out and leveled out. And, and when depression is biological or genetic, sometimes medical treatment is in order. And I'm baffled at this sometimes amongst many people, but also amongst Christians, why the idea of getting treatment for depression is so frowned upon. Why people feel like you shouldn't take medication to treat something like depression. And I see this all the time. It's interesting to me that Christians will take an Advil for a headache, but they won't take some medication, some antidepressants to treat their depression. If it's rooted in biology, well then, you need some medication to deal with that, to counteract that. But not all depression is related to genetics or biology. Another cause, might be difficult life changes, loss of employment, death of a family member, divorce, moving, kids leaving home, kids, themselves moving into college, and these big life changes make us more vulnerable. And the more of those you have collectively, if somebody important to you dies, and then you lose your job, and then the rent goes up, all of those things culminating together, you might have enough coping skills to manage one of those. But with all of those together, sometimes it just stacks up and becomes too much. Another component that contributes to depression is negative words by other people. Do you have any idea how much the weight of our words carry? Sometimes what people say can deeply wound someone else. Your words are powerful. We need to be able to use those for the good. Proverbs 18:21 says the tongue has the power of life and death. And so sometimes negative words are a contributing factor. Our emotions often lead us into depression. And what is an emotion? Well, it's how you feel. And I think it's important to note this, that just because you feel something doesn't make it true. And for many people that struggle with, whether anxiety or depression or self-esteem, whatever that looks like, they believe just because the feeling is present that it makes it so. I feel hopeless, so life must be hopeless. I feel like I have no value, so I must truly have no value. My wife, one of her famous sayings is emotions make a lousy engine but a great caboose. And so emotions are great. We need them, but we need them on the end of the train. We don't want our emotions driving the course of our life, because our emotions will certainly get us into trouble. And so sometimes it's our emotions that are a contributing factor to the development or the maintaining of our depression. To think about this in a spiritual context, and I believe that emotional problems are spiritual problems. There's a spiritual component there. Part of this as well is Satan's accusations. When you're down, Satan will pound on you. He wants you defeated and beaten down and not doing anything to further the kingdom of Christ. The Bible says he's a roaring lion that seeks to kill you, and he will gladly whisper lies into your conscience. In Revelation 12:10, Satan is described as the accuser, and sometimes we fall victim to his discouragement. You'll never change. You'll never overcome this. You're doomed to keep repeating the same mistakes of the past. God can't love you. You're too far gone. These are lies from the accuser, and this leads to a big factor that contributes to our depression. Also, something else we have to consider when looking at the source of depression is our thought life. Everyone has these conversations all day long in their head. It's what we refer to as our self-talk. And often we are not honest with ourselves. Sometimes our thoughts don't reflect what's really real. And we often think things that aren't true, that life can't get better, that no one else could possibly understand what we're going through, that nobody likes me, that it would be better perhaps if I were dead, I have no friends, everything I do is wrong. We lie to ourselves and we think things that aren't real. We're hard on ourselves. We see ourselves in a crooked way. The Apostle Paul writes to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians 10:5, he says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. We are to very much monitor what goes on inside our heads and make sure that it lines up with what Christ says. When we think bad thoughts, we steer our lives in a bad direction. It's why Solomon writes in Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart. For everything you do flows from it. So we have to be very careful what we think about. And it's interesting because, what we think actually shapes our brain. Your brain is always making these connections. Your brain looks like basically a superhighway with all these neuronal connections. And the more we think things, or the more we entertain certain emotions, the more our brains wire together in that fashion. And so our thought life is incredibly, incredibly important for us to take our thoughts captive. Also, another factor that contributes to depression is just our environment. Your environment affects your mental health. And honestly, with all of this COVID stuff happening, there's been a lot going on with people being more isolated, staying at home, not getting out as much, not doing the things that help them to cope, perhaps a change in routine, a change in job, maybe unemployment. That's why we have seen so much depression spike during COVID. The suicide rate has risen, substance abuse rate and overdoses have risen. All of that really makes us think about our environment, but also just on a regular basis, what we put in our environment certainly impacts what we listen to, what we see, the people that we surround ourselves with. It goes back to Solomon and saying, guard your heart. Another thing that contributes to depression and this is a big one, is loss. When we lose something important, you are more likely to at least experience a depressive episode. Loss of a friend, loss of a relationship, loss of, for kids, adolescents, even adults, parents being together, loss of a dream, loss of a family member, death, moving, whatever that was caused from. And often when we experience loss, it just slams us into a dark place. And so now we know some of the factors. That's not all of them. Those are some of the large ones that can contribute or lead to depression. So my next question for you is, how do people often try to deal with pain and depression? Well, often try to relieve pain without ever getting to the source of things, whether that's, trying to master sadness and pain and depressive feelings with a host of different things. Some people use substances. Some people drink or use illicit drugs to manage their pain. They sort of self-medicate, but it doesn't have any long-term effects for them. Some people, use sex to manage their depressive feelings. Some people, harm themselves, which is interesting that harming yourself, and research does show things like cutting yourself and different forms of self-harm actually make people feel better emotionally. I think it releases certain chemicals inside the body that make you feel good, just as a substance would do, but it's not a lasting solution, and it can be certainly habit forming as well. Some people try to ignore their pain, don't acknowledge it, but that doesn't do any good. And so we know what depression is. We know, some of the things that lead to depression. We know what doesn't work when it involves dealing with our depression. And so now I think just briefly, and again, this is a vast topic, and we're just barely scratching the surface to get us thinking a little bit. But I think we should look at some ways to deal with, manage, overcome depression. First and foremost, we should know this: when we are depressed, when life isn't going right, when we're sad, when we're feeling hopeless or stressed or worried, anxiety could tie into this as well, although we could preach, have a whole nother topic on anxiety. But when we're in that place in our life, that is a prime spot for God to really speak into our lives. The famous quote by C.S. Lewis, that God whispers to us in our pleasures, that he speaks into our conscience, but that he shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. God is always speaking to us. Listen to me, lean on me, trust me. Don't try to do life on your own. But when we are down, when we are low, that's often when God can really speak the clearest to us. And in reality, it's if you want to know the truth about depression, it is loss that drives so much of depression. Whether it's loss of loved ones, or loss of a dream, or loss of a job, or a friendship, or a goal, or a physical injury that keeps us from doing something that we've dreamed about our whole lives, or having to leave people behind. Loss does a great deal to drag us into a very dark place sometimes. But life changes usually depress us because there's loss. And often people's negative words remind us of loss. They kind of single in on a hurt that we're experiencing, or of a loss within ourselves, something that we can't be, or that we're inadequate to be. And often our emotions and thought life keep loss at the front and center. And as we said earlier, part of overcoming depression is changing our environment, not letting our emotions drive us, changing what we think about, our thought life, guarding our hearts and what we're exposed to. But that's certainly not all of it. I think we really have to key in on how do we deal with loss. You see, you were never meant to have to deal with loss. God created the world perfect. People were never meant to lose things. God created everything good. But Adam and Eve disobeyed. And because of that, something was lost. What was that? Well, it was paradise. If you ever read John Milton, paradise was lost. Death entered the world. Loss became a part of this world. So how do we deal with loss? Well, we've all experienced loss to some degree, some of us more profoundly than others. But the way we deal with loss is we grieve. And now I know that sounds a little bit weird, but depression is the way that the world deals with loss. Grief is God's way of dealing with loss. So what's the difference? What's the difference between depression on the one hand and grief on the other? I'm glad you asked. Depression keeps us locked into place because depressed people don't deal with things. They don't tackle the problem. They use poor ways of dealing with the pain, whether it's substances, sex, self-harm, or they just ignore it. Depression will stay in our lives and be present as long as we will allow it to be there. But grief, on the other hand, is temporary. It's a process that you go through. Grief is steps you walk through to get to the end of a difficult time. It has an end. We grieve a loss. We grieve over the end of a relationship. We grieve over the death of a dream. We grieve over something precious that was once ours that we can no longer have. But depression hangs onto the heart. It doesn't let go ever. And so depressed people have a tendency to stay isolated. They don't let other people in to help them. They experience their sadness alone. They don't want to bring others in on their problems. They deal with their loss all by themselves. But grief, on the other hand, it connects. When we grieve, when we truly grieve, we pull other people in to our problems. We get people to listen. We get people to share in our loss. We get people to lean on. Romans 12:15, it says this. It says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. When times get hard, that is when we need other people desperately. When we lose something important, grief brings other people into our lives, whereas depression says you can handle this on your own because nobody would probably care enough anyway. So when we grieve, we cry out to God. We lean into God. God, I need your help. I need you. I need assistance. I need you to help me through this. Depression says just avoid the emotion. Don't feel, don't think about it because you'll be sad. Don't bring it up in your mind because you'll be upset. Don't look at those old pictures or you might cry. Don't remember the good times you had with that person or you might fall apart. Depression says avoid the emotion. Grief says, on the other hand, embrace the emotion. That it's okay to feel sad sometimes. In fact, sadness is sort of the vehicle that brings us through this whole episode, but we have to be willing to deal with that sadness and embrace it, because sadness means that we admit that there's a problem. I'm sad because I lost this. But depression lives in denial, and as a result, it's never really over because depression distorts the facts. Grief embraces the painful emotion. I feel sad because I lost something. The relationship is really over. My parents are really divorced. My dream won't be able to happen. Depression distorts reality. Depression gives us a false hope. Grief says there is a loss. It lets us acknowledge our loss. It lets us move forward. And sometimes we have to accept things as they are, not as they should be. In a perfect world, in paradise, this is how it would be if everything was great. We don't live in paradise. We've lost paradise. And so we have to be willing to accept the way things are. And if we can't, we will be locked into depression. And let me just give you a silly example to kind of illustrate this point. Let's suppose my dream was to be a professional athlete, which it was not because I don't have the genetics, perhaps, or maybe even the determination to be a good athlete. But let's suppose that was my dream. And that hasn't happened at this point in my life. It is unreasonable to think as a 38-year-old man that I will be playing in the NFL one day. That was a dream I had, but it will never come to pass. It can't. It's a loss. If I refuse to admit that, then I will stay depressed. And it sounds maybe silly, but for a lot of people, it's a refusal to accept and to grieve the losses that they've experienced. Now, I'm certainly not saying don't dream. I still have many, many dreams. And, many of the dreams that I have, I think, are very much a possibility. But sometimes we hold on to things that can't happen or they won't happen, and we stay depressed. Grief is honest about our loss, but depression, it withdraws. Grief needs, and depression withdraws. Depressed people tend to push other people away. I don't need your help. Leave me alone. Grieving people say, look, I need you here. I can't do this alone. Not in a needy, codependent way, but in an honest, willing to ask for help way. Depression, it does. It keeps people locked in the past. But grief, on the other hand, says, take the present, in the moment here, and deal with the past. So we're not trapped in the past. We're dealing with the problems in the past in the present to find solutions so we can overcome. It's part of that grieving process. Depressed people will not move forward. They stay locked in. They stay victims. They stay, keyed into what happened in the past. But grief says, let's take the resources that we have and let's use those in the present. Let's lean on the people in our lives. Let's call out to God. Let's claim God's promises for our future. And let's deal with the past. So let's recap, because we've talked about a lot. How do we deal with depression? Well, we don't try to deal with it using ways that won't fix it. Now, there's a lot of things we can do to feel good immediately. But when that wears off, it's just a Band-Aid, right? It doesn't move us to a solution. So we don't let our emotions run away with us. We look at what's real. We look at what's factual. We change the way we think. We take our thoughts captive. If we can, we adjust our environments. I've seen people dealing with depression and anxiety, and some of the small things that they can control was waking up at the same time every morning, eating a healthy breakfast. There's research that backs that as well. Making their bed and putting on their clothes, just those things help them get a huge leg up on dealing with some of their anxiety and their depression. I didn't solve it, but it was certainly a big factor in their moving forward. We change the way we think. We take our bad thoughts captive. That is, we don't entertain self-defeating negative thoughts over and over and over. We kick those out. We connect with other people. We don't think we can do it on our own. We don't push people away. We find people to support us. We talk with friends we can trust. We let a pastor know what's going on, and we get some counseling. I can't recommend counseling enough to people. And above all, we let God into our pain. We lean into Him, and He's there for us to talk to. And then sometimes we get angry with God, and I think He can handle that. I think He is there to confide in and talk to, and so we let Him into our pain. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 12:9, he says, "But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." God wants to give us His perfect power in our pain, but we must lean into Him. And so, friend, I want to ask you, where are you right now? Are you dealing with some pain? Now, it may be just some sadness. It may not be a major depressive episode, or you may not have major depressive disorder. Or maybe you're going through a depressive episode, or maybe this is something that you've struggled with for a considerable amount of time, and you know that this is, more along the lines of clinical depression. Is God shouting into your life right now, trying to get your attention? Or maybe He even has your attention. Maybe it's time to take a step forward into the light and to say, you know what, I really have a problem. I can't do this on my own. I need God, and I need some help. The Bible tells us in Psalm 14 that He heals the brokenhearted and He binds up their wounds. God wants to bring us healing, but we have to take some steps. And so before we close, let me say that depression is something that must be dealt with. It's not something that just goes away on its own. And so I would advise you, if you are having a difficult time right now, to speak with a pastor, or maybe it's time to find a therapist and deal with some of the loss that you've experienced and work on going through that process of grief. Maybe you need to find a church to plug into and some people that can support you, or something that, I'm a part of a Celebrate Recovery where there's people there to support you and you can go through some of the steps. And if it's biological or genetic, maybe it's time to consider going to the doctor and looking into medication, and just finding the tools that you need to get to a better place, because depression is a very real thing. And I think it's high time that many Christians come to terms with that, and that they, seek out treatment. And so here's what I do know is life can always get better. When life gets dark, there's always a place where you can step into the light. And I'm very thankful for that light. Hope this message found you encouraged and well, and give you something to think about. Maybe not if in your life, but in the lives of other people that might struggle with some of these things. And so I hope you have a blessed Wednesday, and we'll see you soon.